And once again, we start the program. If you're watching us on Facebook or online afterwards, you'll see a lot of nice scenes of Canada. We should have a contest for people to identify where those scenes are in Canada. I mean, we have big cities, we have the prairies, we have animals and mountains and seascapes, and of course the lovely Canadian flag, which I might point out is one of the most recognized national flags in the world.
Oh.
It's true. It's pretty simple.
Well, it's simple, it's bold, it's clear. The other national flags that are like the most recognized, of course, the United States, Great Britain, Japan has a simple one, which is easily recognized. Canada's in their line. I think Canada's number 5, roughly speaking. Anyway, that's another little factoid for you to start off the program once again. And we have with us in studio Marie-Claude Simard.
Hi, everybody.
Levon Savuns.
Hello.
And attempting to control us in the control room, we have today Carl Boulanger and Benoit Durand and the ever mysterious Pierre Dutil, who is in his, prison mode today. He's got the prison brush cut, and he's wearing the Ingrid Bergman Casablanca striped T-shirt. So I don't know. Maybe did you watch Casablanca this weekend? That's a classic film. Do you know why I was listening to an analysis of that movie, which is a classic movie, and the whole thing was the idea of these people were in a prison, and one of the things was they had the searchlight going around, if you remember the movie, and it always shines on the door of Casablanca, the Rick's American Cafe, like a prison searchlight, and Ingrid Bergman was wearing the striped T-shirt, which of course in the United States at the time, prisoners wore striped jumpers, coveralls and things. So the idea of the director was, here are these people in this prison and they're all trying to get out. So there you go. What that has to do with all the important stuff we have to talk about today, I don't know.
Analysis on the show.
a little bit.
To kick us off.
Now, Lynn, of course, isn't with us today, but she did leave us an item. So what was her item, Marie-Claude?
Yes, it's about a news online and a study conducted by the University of Oxford University that says that Canadians are very inclined to trust news online.
All right. So, Levon, what about you?
Well, I'll talk about the visit by Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland to Washington, where she said that Canada will resist pressure from China to release the Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou, who's wanted by the U.S. On an extradition request.
Yes, speaking of extradition, of course, there are huge protests in Hong Kong over a proposed law there which would enable extradition to mainland China. And I'll speak to a Canadian lawyer originally from Hong Kong who has some thoughts on that. So those are some of the things coming up on today's edition of The Link Online. Well, we're going to start out with that case of these massive demonstrations in Hong Kong. And again, it's against this proposed extradition law with China. That, of course, has hit home with a large number of the Canadian-Chinese community across Canada, many of whom have deep roots in the former British colony. Now, when the colony was handed back to China in 1997, part of the deal was that the area could maintain its separate legal system in a policy known as one country, two systems. And that would be maintained for another 50 years. Andrea Chun, who originally came from Hong Kong, says the proposed law is another attempt to chip away at this 50-year agreement. She's a Canadian lawyer, well-known commentator on Hong Kong affairs, and in our conversation about these demonstrations, I began by asking about a question concerning Carrie Lam, the head of the semi-autonomous government, and Hong Kong's somewhat unusual political system.
She's the highest executive officer, so she is the head of the government. Now, that arm of government has not been democratically elected. She was elected by some 1,200 people. If she has to pass any laws, she still has to introduce the law in the legislature of Hong Kong, which has 70 members.
And she says this is going through regardless of protests and so on.
Absolutely. She actually went on TV, teary-eyed, and she compared herself, the analogy of a mother not giving in to a spoiled kid. Those are my words, spoiled kid. But she was in tears, and she said that you can't just give in because your son or your daughter wants you to do so. She actually used this example. She said that if she were to withdraw this controversial bill, it would actually become a thorn on the side of the protesters because she would never be able to prove this bill was intended to protect Hong Kong.
I was listening to another commentator the other day who felt that she wasn't proposing this law at the behest of the Chinese government. What do you think?
I don't believe that. Everything that happens in Hong Kong has to be implicitly or explicitly sanctioned by Beijing. I don't believe Carrie Lam when she says that Beijing didn't tell her to do so. Definitely Beijing agrees with her stance.
What is it exactly that the protesters are concerned about?
The extradition bill will cover many folks. That includes you and I, journalists who might be visiting Hong Kong after you've done some reporting in China. China could have issued a warrant against anybody for allegedly committing certain crimes and ask the Hong Kong courts to extradite the alleged criminal back for trial in China. Chinese government or Chinese courts are not independent. They are not used to the rule of law just like what we are used to. There's no protection of freedoms, of the rights of the accused. There's no fair trial. It's really, in my view, an arm of the state. And therefore, Hong Kongers are very, very concerned that trumped-up charges could be levied against anyone. And as a result of this bill, if passed into law, folks would be extradited to China for trials. And that's very, very scary. If this law is passed, I think the other real concern for me as a lawyer especially is the pressure that's being levied on the judicial system, and by that I mean the judges. This bill, in its current form, will give the judges the right or the power to decide whether or not to extradite. And a lot of these judges are already under extreme pressure, I believe, to go with the official flow. And I really question how long the judicial system can hold up under this type of pressure, and for the judicial system to stay truly free from coercion and pressure. That is my biggest fear, that the last bastion of the rule of law might fall.
And that was Canadian lawyer Andrea Chun commenting on the demonstrations in Hong Kong against this proposed extradition law. The full interview is available on the website under the highlights section. Now we have some video, I think, don't we, of the demonstrations that are taking place, or that did take place, because I think what has happened...
Oh, there's an ad. I forgot to warn.
But yeah, there was, of course, the police were called in to put an end to these things, and there have been some injuries, a couple of which have been very, very extensive. There are claims that the police were using rubber bullets. The authorities claim that's not the case, but there are some people who are seriously wounded in hospital, apparently. But Carrie Lam has said that this bill is going through regardless. The demonstrations mean nothing. It's going to be passed. And we saw a photograph of her on the website. And as Andrea Chun said, she went on TV to say, "Oh, I'm like a mother, and these are like a spoiled child, and we can't be ruled by spoiled children," sort of thing. Now that's a paraphrase of what she said, but. Also, the other thing, of course, is because of those injuries, apparently the organizers of the demonstrations have said we should call these off because we don't want more people to get injured by the police, who have been rather strongly, shall we say, pushing the protesters back and trying to break them up. So that situation is still ongoing. We'll see what happens there. Tense situation in Hong Kong. And again,
she had tears in her eyes when she was talking. Carry on. She looked very sincere.
Well, it's a society that is not used to discord. I mean, culturally, it's a society that actually treasures or puts a lot of emphasis on unity. So I guess there's also a lot of fear of how this will be interpreted in Beijing, whether this will actually force an even stronger reaction from mainland China. So it's a very interesting balancing act that she has to perform. On the one hand, trying to keep her legitimacy with the population of Hong Kong, but also making sure they don't cross the authorities in Beijing too much.
Who, of course, could theoretically just have done with the whole thing.
Absolutely.
Because there is this 50-year agreement. When Britain handed it back, because Britain had like a 99-year lease on the colony, and when they handed it back, part of the deal was, okay, but you have to at least give them 50 years of what they know now, this judicial and political system, I suppose, to some extent, so to gently ease into the communist type of authoritarian regime there. So,
and who knows what China will would look like in another 25 years. So,
yeah, it was a busy week in the streets of Hong Kong, with also before that the Tiananmen Square, ceremonies. There was a lot
the anniversary of Tiananmen.
Yeah.
and Hong Kong is probably the only place in China where it was officially commemorated, or not officially, but at least people commemorated it.
in the
Acknowledged.
Yeah,
Because
publicly. Yeah.
Because there's a whole generation in China who know nothing about it, because it's expunged from the history books, it's expunged from the media. There was some reporters on the street asking Chinese students and so on, and they had that famous picture of the Chinese student standing in front of the tank, and they asked these people, do you know what this picture is? And they said, no, I've never seen that before. So there you go. Anyway, speaking of extradition,
Yes.
we have a Canadian reaction to an extradition case which is causing a lot of controversy and tension between Canada and China, and that's coming up next. Okay, this concerns the case of Huawei Chief Financial Officer Meng Wanzhou, and that, of course, continues to cause problems between Canada and China. Beijing, for its part, continues to detain 2 Canadians who were arrested days after Canada detained Ms. Wang at the request of U.S. authorities. They want her extradited to the U.S. to face charges related to breaching American sanctions on Iran. And Levon Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland was in Washington yesterday, actually seeking help from the United States in this whole affair, which involves all 3 countries, United States, Canada, and China, and we're caught in the middle.
Absolutely. Caught between the hard place and the rock, I guess. It's between the fight between 2 giants, and Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are paying the price. They've already spent 186 days in a Chinese jail. They're accused of spying and endangering Chinese national security, and they face the death penalty if convicted. And unlike Miss Meng, who is free on bail in Vancouver and has been able to hire the best lawyers money can buy in Canada, Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor have not been allowed to see any lawyers. They are allowed, though, to regular visits from Canadian diplomatic officials. Actually, they were visited by Canadian diplomats on Wednesday and on Thursday. But their detention is only one part of this Chinese pressure on Canada. Beijing is also putting pressure on Canadian agricultural products, especially canola. Suddenly, they're coming up with all these inspections, and basically exports of Canadian canola have all but stopped, and now they're threatening pork and other products. And what worse, it appears that the Chinese leadership has decided not to take the calls from Foreign Affairs Chrystia Freeland or even Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And this kind of prompted speculation and suggestions that maybe Canada should send someone to China they'd be willing to talk to. And one name that came up was the former Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, who has really good relations with the Chinese leadership. And then, in an interview with the Globe and Mail newspaper, Mr. Chrétien floated the idea that maybe what Canada would need to do is actually let Ms. Meng go, basically short-circuit the extradition process and just let her go. And Foreign Affairs Chrystia Freeland was asked about that yesterday in Washington, and this is some of what she had to say.
When it comes to the extradition request for around Ms. Meng, Canada has very carefully and intentionally abided by our extradition treaty commitments. We are a rule of law country, and rule of law is not something you can pick and choose. Either you are a rule of law country or you are not. When it comes to Ms. Meng, there has been no political interference. This has been entirely about officials taking decisions according to Canada's commitments, and that is the right way for extradition requests to proceed. As Canadians know very well, her case is now before the courts. That is where they should be. She has excellent lawyers and full access to Canada's due process, which is also absolutely right and correct. I have tremendous faith and confidence in Canadian courts. Ms. Meng and her lawyers will have a chance to make their case, and I have complete confidence that the courts will make a right and fair decision. I'd also like to say on this particular issue that as a country, as a government, we need to be very thoughtful and very mindful of precedents that our actions and our decisions set. And I think when we reflect on it, it will be clear to all of us that it would be a very dangerous precedent indeed for Canada to alter its behavior when it comes to honoring an extradition treaty in response to external pressure. And I think when we think about the implications of setting such a precedent, we could easily find ourselves in a situation where, by acting in a single specific case, we could actually make all Canadians around the world less safe. And that is a responsibility that I take very seriously.
And that was Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland speaking to reporters in Washington. And as you can hear, there, it's almost like she's talking about a hostage taking. If we give in on this, then everybody else is, all the other Canadians overseas, face the same risk of this arbitrary detentions. And of course, China says, well, it's Canada's problem. This is a problem of Canada's doing, that they shouldn't have followed on this U.S. extradition request, which they are demanding that the U.S. withdraw. And of course, China sees this as an attempt by the United States to stop the rise of China's power, to stop one of the crown jewels of Chinese industrial, technological, marvels, this giant Huawei company from taking off and really competing with American companies. And they're saying that the U.S. is trying every dirty trick in the book to stop Huawei from competing with the likes of, Apple and Cisco and everybody else who's involved in this communications technologies and the next generation of communications technologies, the 5G networks.
On the other hand, of course, there are a lot of security experts around the world who say there is concern about backdoors and so on in that technology.
Absolutely, but to be fair, one has to say that no one has ever actually discovered a backdoor, has been able to show the existence of a backdoor. And so some of the experts are also saying, listen, this equipment gets checked so thoroughly that it would be very, very hard for a company like Huawei to exploit these backdoors. And it's probably one of the reasons why a lot of countries, including Canada, are resisting attempts by the US to force them to basically abandon Huawei as one of the suppliers for these 5G networks. Because a lot of countries are saying, listen, yes, there absolutely are concerns, but so far there's been no factual evidence of anybody actually finding one of these backdoors.
But then on the other hand, of course, would you want to publicly announce that you had found a backdoor? I mean, because that would mean you have certain technological abilities that you may not necessarily want the other side to know about, or any other side to know about.
If you are a big government, probably not. But if you're a corporation, what's holding you back from saying, you know what, we found this back door? Because I understand why, for example, the National Security Agency in the US or in Canada, the CSE, would be reluctant to admit that they found these back doors because maybe they want to exploit them as well. But I don't think big communication companies like Bell or anybody else would be, reluctant to do so if they do. And they'll be held responsible in courts if it ever comes out that they knew about. Imagine all the lawsuits, all the class action lawsuits that would follow if a Western communication company is discovered to have known about this vulnerability and not done anything to close it and to warn its customers.
Well, they might not warn their customers, but they might warn the government that they'd found something. And again, this might be kept, kind of secret from the general population, because you don't want the general population to be freaking out over the fact that some of their theoretically, they're not interested in you and me in our communications, but they could very well be interested in technical company information. It's known that a lot of Western technology has somehow ended up in China and reproduced there, and so on and so forth. So I don't know. It's kind of a delicate situation, one way or the other.
Absolutely, but I also don't forget that any security service, including the one in the United States, are known to fudge facts, to hide things. We wouldn't know about the surveillance if it weren't for people like Edward Snowden, who exposed it. We know the U.S. intelligence community made up intelligence to justify their invasion of Iraq. So when it comes to, I think, when you look at this critically, you realize that as an authoritarian country, China has at its disposal enormous resources that it could put to bear on any company, including a privately owned company like Huawei. But also, we have to be, I guess, cognizant of the fact that the U.S. and Western allies are no angels either, and U.S. routinely uses backdoors in the U.S. produced equipment to spy on everybody else around the world.
On the other hand, of course, we have the new Chinese law, which says every company and every individual must aid the central intelligence agencies and the People's Army and so on and so forth. So that too, wait a minute, theoretically, Huawei is obliged under Chinese law to anything they do or any information they find out, theoretically, they must turn that over to the intelligence services in China.
As American companies, we don't. Of course, the bar in the U.S. is a lot higher. It's a democratic country with strong courts and legal systems. So, but we know that under national security, a lot of these companies can be either cajoled or coerced to cooperate with intelligence services, provide access to their databases, to their communications networks, it's a big game, and I think that we have to be very cognizant that it's a big game being played by very big powers, and
A lot of them, not just one or two.
yes.
All right. Okay, let's move on. Speaking of all kinds of electronic stuff and so on and so forth, we turn things over to Marie-Claude.
Yes, well, you know how I always encourage our listeners to download our app on their phone. I do that again today. And I also encourage you guys to go on our, or not you guys, but you guys in the world, to go on our website and to trust our news. Now, that's why Lynn's story caught my attention, the title being Canadians Trust Online News, but Few Are Willing to Pay. So Lynn spoke to an expert from the University of Laval who actually participated in a very big study conducted by the University of Oxford University. And it involved respondents from 38 countries, including Canada, and it found that 52% of Canadians trust online news. So most of the time, and 60% 60% believe the news media help them understand the news. However, only 9% of respondents say they had paid for online news. So she spoke to Colin Bryn from the University of Laval.
Well, it's a major concern for newspapers, especially because they're relying more and more on income from readers as their advertising revenue declines and as online advertising money goes mostly to large digital companies like Google and Facebook.
How much are they suffering?
They say that their annual advertising revenue has gone down about 60% since 2000. So it's major, and we've seen cutbacks in newsrooms, which only makes it harder for them to convince people to subscribe.
What were the bright spots in this report?
In general, the level of trust is high compared to other countries. Canadians are among the top 5 countries of the 38 surveyed in terms of trust, general trust towards media and news. But looking at more specific issues of content, depth of coverage, and just the fact that news helps them understand the world, we're at the very, very top of the survey of the list of countries. So that's encouraging. Also, people are adopting, I would say, protective behaviors regarding disinformation. So 70% of Canadians say they've either checked several sources for a news story or just relied on a more reliable source, a more trustworthy source for news, or just being a little bit more careful before sharing content online. So we see that all this talk about fake news is actually making people change a little bit their news habits.
What else stood out for you in this report?
In terms of payment, we see that young people are a little bit more open to payment in the future. We'll have to see also in Canada, because there's these tax credits that are proposed by the federal government. They're not yet in place, but to encourage newspapers to put in paywalls, but also for news readers to actually subscribe. So we would actually be able to have a tax-deductible subscription. Also for donations, but donations are very, very low. There's just not a lot of options out there for non-profit news organizations. And
all right, unfortunately, we're almost out of time for that report, but if you want to hear more about that, you can go onto the highlights section of our website. Yeah. And it is interesting that 52%, I would have thought it was higher that Canadians would have trusted online news. I mean, we do our best considering. Yeah. And we have, of course, a lot of very reliable news sources.
The Canadians are among the top 5 countries, so I'll find out that one.
Well, I don't know. I think given all the publicity, we get around fake news and stuff, I'm actually surprised it's not fewer people who trust online news, because in the old days you bought a newspaper, it was physical, you knew there's a whole team working on it. Now anybody with a little computer in their home can fake a fabulous news site. It looks amazing. How do you know whether this is a reliable news source or not?
Well, indeed. Well, but again, we have these reliable newspapers which have their own websites, so theoretically you can go on there, and that should theoretically be very reliable. Anyway, that's all the time we have. If you have any thoughts on what you have heard of the program, drop us a line. And now for Marie-Claude and Levon and and myself and Pierre and Carl and Monsieur Durand. Thank you so much for listening to us today. Bye-bye.